Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another WILMIC Fall Seminar. Thanks for being here, and thank you to all of you on the web that are viewing live. This is, I believe, our 18th year of our fall seminar, and I think we have a good program today. I want to tell all of you that the program has been approved for 3 ethics credits. So if this is a reporting year for you, you will find it on the Board of Bar Examiners website as a listed course that has been approved. We have 3 hours. We'll go from 9 to noon. We'll split into 2 halves. The first half we will have Caryn Sullivan speak to us, and then we'll have a panel discussion in the second half of the program. For those of you in the room, the network, the Wi-Fi network is guest. The password is autumn. So if you want to get on the network, you can do it that way. For those of you watching on the web, if you want to submit a question or a comment, you can go to the question tab on your screen and you can submit the question. We will get it in live time and we will answer it at that point. So let's get started. Our first speaker is Caryn Sullivan. Caryn is a lawyer from Minneapolis, Minnesota. She got her bachelor's degree in mass communications from the University of Utah, her law degree from William Mitchell College of Law. She has been a contributing columnist for the St. Paul Pioneer Press since 2007. She was honored with the ARC of Minnesota Community Excellence Award in 2008. She is an author and a national speaker. She speaks about autism, empowerment, loss, life, and legacy. And she is an active volunteer. She serves on the board of Fraser on the University of Minnesota Health, Mothers, and Children's Advisory Committee, and she is a founding member of the Women's Impact Foundation. I am very pleased to present to you Caryn Sullivan.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning. It's always a delight to be in Madison, in Wisconsin, generally. I don't have personal roots in Wisconsin, but I married a guy from Wisconsin, and together we had 4 children, and of course they all think they're from Wisconsin. I imagine you know how that goes. I'm looking forward to talking to you today about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. It's about how to navigate adversity, because it's something that we all have in common. So I was here in May of 2016 to celebrate my baby's graduation from the University of Wisconsin. I had wished it was Minnesota. University of Wisconsin-Madison. If anyone recalls, May of 2016, the weather that day was pretty much like the weather right now. So I sat out there in Camp Randall with my family who'd flown in for the big occasion and kept thinking about how I wished I had packed my really, really warm winter jacket, the one that I wear when I walk the dog that goes all the way down below my knees, because it was in the mid-30s that day with the wind chill. And what I had hoped it was going to be like was this. You know, this is an idyllic scene from the Eagle River part of Wisconsin. This is a friend's cabin, and you know, this was what I had imagined the day was going to be like. It was going to be nice and warm, you know, 60s, 70s. It was just going to be a really comforting day. But that's not really the way life works, is it? I've decided that weather is sort of a metaphor for life. All sorts of things happen. While we hope that most of our lives will spend with the weather being like it was captured in that picture on that beautiful lake, the reality is every so often something happens and the weather changes. Now, in the case of an earthquake, the change occurs with no warning whatsoever. One day your foundation is solid, and the next day it's broken up underneath you. And the interesting thing about earthquakes, it's not something we really have to worry about in this part of the country, but people all over the world do, is that while the first incident comes with no warning, when there's an aftershock, we're better prepared for it, because we know that that's oftentimes the way it goes. We have the initial event, and then we have the aftershock. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen, We don't know what the extent of the damage is going to be, but it's much more predictable than the original event. And then, of course, this is something we're more familiar with in this part of the country. You know, tornadoes come and there's a little bit of warning. We've got those tornado sirens. We're not certain exactly where the tornado is going to strike or what kind of damage it's going to inflict. But we have enough time often to secure the animals if we're farmers, or to put the porch furniture away, to get ourselves to the basement, to protect ourselves a bit from the storm. And we know that tornadoes tend to be a little more seasonal, so we can be more watchful and anticipate them at certain times of the year. Now, of course, this is a photo from the recent storms down in Florida. Again, we in this part of the country don't have to worry about hurricanes, but people all over, you know, the southern climates do. And the interesting thing about hurricanes, and particularly if you think about what happened, you know, with the storms this past season, is that we have more notice that they're going to come. But we don't know exactly which direction they're going to go in. In the case of the recent storms, we didn't know if they were going to go up the Gulf Coast of Florida, if they were going to go up the Atlantic coast, or if they were going to go straight up the middle. We didn't know whether the worst damage would come from the winds or the water or a combination of the two. Some people were very diligent and obedient, and they heeded the evacuation warnings. We saw the lines of people heading north. And other people were more defiant and said, no, we're going to stay. So much so that the Texas governor said to the people who said, we're staying, we're Texas strong. Okay, if that's your choice, get a Sharpie marker and write your Social Security on your forearm, because we're not coming to rescue you. And that just reflects that people plan for and people respond to the dangers and the risks that storms bring us in a whole variety of ways. So, as Tom said, you know, I'm a lawyer by training, I'm a journalist by training. I'm not a meteorologist, but I'm a good student of life. And I figured out that there's a real strong correlation between the weather and our lives, between the weather and the practice of law. When the storms come in, they can take our homes. You know, the people who were on the coast who were hit by the hurricanes, they lost their homes. People, when tornadoes strike, especially if you're in a mobile home, there may be absolutely nothing left. You might be lucky enough to be able to gather up the family photos. And when you lose your home, that's one of the most significant things that you can lose in your life. But it's interesting to see how people respond. There are those people who say, it was all just things. We lost our stuff, but we didn't lose our lives. And then there are the people who are completely devastated and they have difficulty moving on. People lose their transportation. If you can't get around, that becomes a real problem in your life. But again, it's just a thing. A vehicle is just a thing. It's replaceable. But some people are better able or better positioned to substitute their transportation than others. Some people lose their livelihood. You know, if you're a fisherman and the storm comes in and it takes your boat, then you have to figure out how you can start over. You have to figure out how you're going to deal with the insurance company. Do you have any savings put away to help you to purchase another boat, to get back on your feet? You know, if you have a restaurant that's destroyed during the storm, there are all sorts of people who are impacted by that. Then there are the people who have the physical harm. We've seen a lot of that the last few months through incidents that come in like storms, completely unexpected. People who go to a social event, people who go to church, people who go to a concert, and all of a sudden they're wounded or they've lost their lives. And it not only affects our physical health, it affects our mental health and our well-being. It goes to the core of our psyche and just leaves us wondering, how am I going to get through this? And so as lawyers, if you're in a practice where you are constantly dealing with people who have problems that affect any of these areas of their lives, you're often in a position of not only helping people to figure out how to manage that particular storm, but how to move forward. Because these kinds of events, these storms, whether it's hurricanes, tornadoes, or earthquakes, can take us to our knees. I'm sure you've seen it. You may have been there yourselves, where something happens, bidden or unbidden, expected or completely out of the blue, and it takes you to your knees. And then you find yourself at this crossroads where there are two paths in front of you. If you go in one direction, you're going to be that bitter person who people avoid. That bitter person who can only focus on the negative, who doesn't see the lessons in life's experiences, but is focused on, why me? And the interesting thing about people like that is they're lonely. It's like there's a neon sign surrounding them, that just an aura that just broadcasts to people that this is a person who's gone in that direction. And we're all trying to navigate our own lives. We don't have the energy or the capacity to manage those people as well. The other direction is to say, there are lessons in this experience. There are tools that I can use. There are people I can go to, people I can rely upon. And I choose the other path. This is hard. This feels overwhelming, but I can do this. I'm going to emerge from this situation, and I'm going to be better. And I submit that what defines us, what distinguishes us as people, is how we respond. And so I hope when you leave today, you'll have some ideas about that, and that'll be in the forefront of your mind, and that you'll have that visual of that fork in the road, and think about it not only as you're navigating the storms that come and go in your own lives, but as you help your clients or your colleagues or the people in your lives to navigate the storms that come into their lives. When the hurricane strikes, or the tornado sets down, or something awful happens in our lives, we're hoping, we're sort of, broadcasting this SOS. Somebody come. Somebody save me. And we've seen a lot of that. In the midst of all sorts of awful things that have happened in our country in the last few months, there are a lot of people who climb into those boats, and they take an oar, and they row, and they go and they rescue strangers. They rescue their loved ones. They're doing it together. And you may be on the receiving end of a call for help when someone whose life has been impacted by a storm ends up in your office. And the only words on their lips, the only word is help. So, how do you do that? The goal as lawyers, we're trained to write. We're trained to argue. We're trained to, submit briefs and answer interrogatories and draft wills and represent people in court. Our goal is, when a client comes in, to achieve what would be considered an optimal outcome. But there are all sorts of things that come into play that I don't recall learning about in law school. And it's those human elements that inform the experience that we're going to have with someone who's oftentimes a complete stranger, who comes into your life for a period of time. And they present you with a really personal problem that you're challenged to help them resolve. sometimes it's people who you know well. And if you live in a small community, you may know the people who you represent more than if you live in a large city and you're representing clients who you know nothing about. But we all bring our own life experiences to the lawyer-client relationship, and we all bring our own biases and our own expectations and our own prejudices, whether consciously or not, to a relationship.
Hi, what's your name, darling?
My name is Susan Boyle.
Okay, Susan, where are you from?
I am from Blackburn near Bathgate, West Lothian.
It's a big town.
It's a sort of collection of, villages. Had to think there.
And how old are you, Susan?
I am 47. And that's just one side of me.
Okay, what's the dream?
I'm trying to be a professional singer.
And why hasn't it worked out so far, Susan?
I've never been given the chance before, but here's hoping it'll change.
Okay, and who would you like to be as successful as?
Elaine Page.
Elaine
something like
Page.
that.
What are you going to sing tonight?
I'm going to sing I Dreamed a Dream from Les Miserables.
Okay.
Big song.
Yeah? Yes.
I dreamed a dream in time gone by. When the skies were blue.
You didn't expect that, did you? Did you? No.
I dreamed of love would never die. I knew that God would be forgiven. I was young and unafraid. When dreams are made and used and wasted, there was no ransom to be paid. No song unsung, no wine untasted. But the tigers come with their voices soft as thunder, as they tear your hopes apart, as they turn your dreams to shame. Still I dream you'd come to me. And we would live our lives together. But there are dreams which cannot be, and there are storms we cannot weather. I had a dream my life would be so different from this hell I'm living, so different now from what it seems. Now life has killed the dream I dreamed.
Hello.
Hey, come back here.
All right. Thank you very much, Susan. Piers.
Without a doubt, that was the biggest surprise I have had in 3 years on this show. When you stood there with that cheeky grin and said, I want to be like Elaine Page, everyone was laughing at you. No one is laughing now. That was stunning, an incredible performance. amazing. I'm reeling from shock. How about you two? But
I am
Can't
so
believe it.
thrilled because I know that everybody was against you. I honestly think that we were all being very cynical, and I think that's the biggest wake-up call ever. And I just want to say that it was a complete privilege listening to that. It was brilliant.
Susan, I knew the minute you walked out on that stage that we were going to hear something extraordinary, and I was right.
Not a lot of touch.
Susan, you are a little tiger, aren't you?
I don't know about that.
You
I don't know
are.
about that.
Okay, moment of truth. Here's yes or no.
the biggest yes I have ever given anybody.
Amanda?
Yes, definitely. Brilliant.
Susan Boyle, you can go back to the village with your head held high. It's 3 yeses.
Okay, so let's deconstruct that a little bit. Has anyone seen that before? I've watched that a number of times, and it's so uplifting, and yet it's also really sort of heartbreaking for me. Does anyone know the Susan Boyle story? She went on after this, and she produced a record that broke records, and she was also diagnosed with Asperger's. So if you look at this, we're going to talk today about expectations and communications. And so I think that this is really a useful tool because we all bring our talents and our expertise, and mine is not technology, I'm working on it here, to an experience. But let's kind of look at what happens here. She walks off on the stage, and what happens immediately when people look at her? What is it? Why are they rolling their eyes?
They're dismissing her based on her appearance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And does she get it?
I'm thinking. I think she has gotten it her whole life.
Well, gotten what, though?
Well, gotten that treatment and gotten that she has not been given a chance. As she said, what is, in response to the question, why haven't you realized that dream? Because I've never been given the opportunity. That she gets.
Right. But do you think, let's go forward here a little bit.
Say to me.
A person with Asperger's just doesn't pick up on normal social cues.
Right. Right. So do you think that she understands, she knows she hasn't been given the opportunity, but do you think that she understands why? That she walks out here in that little frock with her sticker plastered on her chest. Like, who of us would do that, right? But it's just really striking that, look at that woman's face. I mean, people can just be awful, can't they? Based on assumptions that they make. And yet, we value appearance so much, but when you get to a point where now she shares her gift, all of a sudden what happens? They reconsider.
Everyone is transformed.
Right. They give her a second chance. Oh, so she's really dowdy and she's odd, but wow, does she have a gift? And so she goes on and she interacts with them. She's got her champions here, doesn't she? These are her guys in the lifeboat. These young guys who knew what the others didn't, who were like, yeah. We know that about her because they knew her before. okay, Simon Cowell is now smitten because now they're playing in the same playground, right? This is what he does. And she's established that she's good enough. And so all of a sudden, there is this connection and this rapport that was absent when there wasn't information. If you look at her face there when they start asking her the questions, it's the comment that you made earlier here about with the Asperger's, not understanding the nuances of the conversation. She didn't. And so when he says to her, "You're quite a tiger, aren't you?" She's like, She doesn't get it. Because that's not how her mind works. That's not how she communicates. That's part of her Asperger's. It's something that just goes right over her head.
And yet she also illustrated her skills of compensation, because he said, "You're a little tiger," and she said, "Well, I'm not so sure about little." The self-deprecating humor and the having some kind of response, despite the fact that she didn't really get the nuances, as you say.
It didn't completely escape her, but it wasn't part of her vernacular. So we'll talk a little bit more about communication later, and even later on today. But I think that there's a lot in this short video that can translate into how we deal with people when they come into your office and you don't know anything about them. You know, to not be quick to make assumptions about people based on their appearance or, you know, how they present themselves, because there may well be something else that's going on that's not immediately apparent. And in her case with Asperger's, you know, the autism spectrum, it's an invisible disability, and it's not something that's easily broadcast, like if someone is blind and they come into your office using a cane. It takes more to learn about it. So there are a lot of other things that will come into play when you're dealing with clients. Is anyone familiar with the term adverse childhood experience? So adverse childhood experience is something I learned about. I experienced but didn't know that there was a name for it early in life. And adverse childhood experience is something that's got its tentacles all throughout the lawyer-client relationship, because oftentimes it's those things that happen to us when we're young that impact how we relate to the world later in life. It's people who grow up in a home where there's substance abuse or sexual abuse or verbal abuse. It's people who grow up in a home where maybe one parent is incarcerated. People who grow up in a home, as I did, twice broken by the time I was 16, where families are changing and they're being reconfigured all the time. And so it keeps people off balance. And it has an effect on how we view the world, how we interact with people. There are studies that demonstrate the more adverse childhood experiences you have in your life, the poorer your health will be. So there's a correlation between adverse childhood experiences and cancer, for example. So a lot of times clients will come into your office and they've had these things and they don't even know about them. Like I said, I was well beyond law school when I understood that there was a term for what had happened when my mom left my dad and took us, with 7 children between them, out of the country without giving us a chance to say goodbye to our dad. That's something that stays with you at some level throughout your lifetime. And so when other things happen to you in your life, when you've gone through something traumatic like that, it impacts the way that you interact with people. It impacts your level of trust. It has an effect on your attitude, your expectations. And so when you're dealing with clients, they may or may not have adverse childhood experiences that will affect the way that they interact with you, what their expectations are, how much control they feel that they want. You may have your own adverse childhood experiences and be completely unaware of it, as I was, not knowing that there was a name for what it, the experience of growing up with an alcoholic or abusive parent. There's also something that I find fascinating that's called ambiguous loss. Is anyone familiar with that term? There's a psychologist at the University of Minnesota who coined this term back in the 70s in the context of absent fathers, in the period of time where my own mother was kind of doing that, if it feels good, do it kind of thing, without consideration for how an adult's behavior impacts a child. And so there are a lot of things that happen with our lives that we don't really have a label for. We don't necessarily know what they are or how they're affecting us. But ambiguous loss can feel like death. There's a lot of sadness surrounding it. And it can be something that goes on for a very long time. And that's part of what makes it so difficult to deal with. Now, when Tom introduced me, he said that I'm a lawyer. I'm going to be really honest with you. I'm a recovering attorney. I left the practice of law in 1993 very abruptly when my son was diagnosed with autism. That's why the Susan Boyle story is so personal for me, because I feel a lot of what she felt there as a mom. So in 1993, when there was very little known about autism, other than maybe Rain Man was sort of the movie representation of that condition, my son was diagnosed. I was 5 months pregnant with my daughter, who graduated from Madison, and I knew this was a big deal. I didn't have family support. I didn't really have anybody around me to help. I had a husband who was a trial attorney who was not happy when I decided to take a leave of absence because I knew this was a big deal. And so I went very rapidly from being a partner at an international law firm to being a stay-at-home mom. And for a long time, when people would ask me what I did, I couldn't answer, because I never imagined that I was going to be a suburban stay-at-home mom. It didn't fit with my training and my anticipation, my dreams, as Susan Boyle sings about. But it was what I knew I had to do. And it wasn't until my son was about 15 years old that I finally came to terms with the fact that autism wasn't something I was going to fix. I was not a carpenter with a tool belt. This is who he is. And I was able to bring some finality to the situation that just felt like it was going on forever and ever. And now he's 26. And he's got his challenges, and he's got his strengths, and he's got his wonderful personality. And I've accepted that he is who he is. So I don't feel that sense of loss so acutely as I did for 15 years, because I didn't really know what I was dealing with. And so that's just one example of how ambiguous loss can come into play and affect someone's life. You know, people would meet me and I would just be sad. You know, I had this huge loss. This was my firstborn. I thought he was going to be playing football like my friends' kids, and I thought he would be going to a good college like his siblings did. I thought he was going to ride the big bus, not that little bus. And so that's just something I lived with for a very long time. So ambiguous loss can affect us personally and professionally. You know, in my case, that one example illustrates how it affected me in both ways. It was my personal, the loss of a lot of the relationships that I had, as a professional woman, they all evaporated. My professional identity wasn't the same. And so that's one way that it can affect us. Ambiguous loss can happen when a person is physically present but emotionally absent. Or it can happen when someone is physically absent but emotionally present. So a couple of examples of that. I gave you the example of the autism. So my son has autism. He's there, but he's not there in the way that I imagined that he would be. Alzheimer's. I saw a billboard last night that says in this county there are 7,000 people living with Alzheimer's. So is that personal? Anybody have personal experience with that? You know, it's something that's more and more common. It terrifies me. It's more common among women than men. But you've got a person who's physically present, but they're not there the way that they used to be. I often think that Alzheimer's and autism are like cousins. You know, there are a lot of similarities. You've got a person here. They need a lot of supervision. They are unpredictable. You don't know what they might say or do. I remember when my grandfather had Alzheimer's and he used to say, "Oh, the women are chasing me." You know, you just never know what they might blurt out. Same is true for a person with autism. They don't have that filter. You never know what might come out of their mouths. It's typically something really honest and straightforward that the rest of us think but wouldn't say, but you just never know. And addiction, the opioid epidemic around our country is just so concerning and so significant. And it's infiltrating all sorts of families, and it's becoming more acceptable for people to talk about it than it used to be. I started writing about that in 2010, about people who were raising their kids in really nice homes, who all of a sudden had to decide whether to let them sleep in their car under a bridge, because every time they come home, they rob everything of value to sell to support their habit. These are huge problems that people are living with, but they don't have a term for it. But it affects the way that we interact with people. And so it can be within your professional network, it can be in your office, it can be in your family, it can be in your own life. And you may not have known what it is, but this is what it is. Of course, we have, death. So people may come into your practice, people may come into your life who have experienced, a loss through death. It used to be that we thought of death in terms of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's, stages of grief. And now the professionals are saying, we sort of misinterpreted that. Her stages of grief, as she defined them, were really intended for the people who were dying, not for the bereaved. So we think that people are going through these stages of grief when we're interacting with them in our lives because they have someone that they've lost, but that's not necessarily true. In my own experience, I have felt like death is more like a wave. It comes in, and when it's fresh, it feels like it can knock you to your knees, like that horse that I showed you the photo of. Over time, it kind of laps at your ankles, and it can be situational. It happens in those big moments that we all experience in our lives where we expected that loved one to be right there with us. Graduations, weddings, births, those big moments. And we may not anticipate that. We may not think about it in terms of the people that we're interacting with, because life goes on and they may not be saying something. But you may have a coworker or a family member or a client who is having a big moment or an anniversary without a loved one that they've lost to death, and that just may affect their whole psyche in the way that they communicate and interact, and you may not know it. So when clients come into your office, they bring their expectations. They're looking for good outcomes. They're looking for good communication. And so it's important to set the expectations based on what they are looking for and what you have to offer within the framework of what you're duty-bound to do as a lawyer, right? But we can't just assume that we're on the same page without really addressing it. I mean, think back to the Susan Boyle video. We can't make assumptions without having these conversations.
warn you, Apu does not have very much money.
Are you absolutely sure? Because legally, I am allowed to shake him by the ankles and see what falls out. It's established in the case of lawyers versus justice. That was a wonderful day for us. Even.
Now, we have 8 children. Will that affect the settlement?
Perhaps.
No offense, but you remind me of the monkey man who slaughtered my family's chickens.
Yes, I get that a lot.
I have to think all of this over. I still have feelings for Apu.
I understand. Who is Apu?
The face of divorce is not as beautiful as I had hoped. Perhaps there is another way.
When will you humans learn that your feelings, as you call them, can stand in the way of big cash payoffs?
So what were the 2 clues in there about expectations? Well, what were his expectations? She has 8 kids. Mr. Green was going to make a big appearance, right? This potentially could be a cash cow for him. But for her, she came into that consult thinking one thing, but then what happened? She started to reconsider because the face of divorce may not be exactly what she had imagined it to be. So that may or may not have taken them forward. So this brings us to communication. And we know that communication is the hub of the wheel. I mean, as lawyers, we're trained to write briefs, to argue, to do client counseling, and so forth. But the failure of communication is one of the biggest problems that gets lawyers into trouble, right? And with the changing society today and the way that we communicate so differently, we don't have typewriters anymore. Do people still dictate to staff, or does everybody write their own stuff on their computer? You know, it's changed a lot, right? We have cell phones, and we may even give our clients our phone numbers. We may get texts from clients. And so it's really important to define the scope of the expectations and how the communication comes into play with that. Because if your client's expecting that they're going to be hearing from you as soon as they send you an email or maybe even a text, and you're in court or you're tied up with grandma at the senior center because she's got Alzheimer's, or you've got a kid who is performing in a play and you can't respond, then what happens to the expectations? All of a sudden you've got a really unhappy client. And think about who this client is. Maybe you have absolutely no idea that they have serious trust issues because they've had all of these experiences in their life, and everyone lets them down. No, they're not going to come into your office when you have that consult and say, I just want you to know that this is what's happened in my life. All of these bad things have happened, and people lie to me all the time. But that's there. And so somehow you've got to figure out how you're going to make this communication and this interaction as successful as possible, because again, our goal is to achieve the optimal outcome, right? So hopefully clients won't be that surprised to know that you actually talk with them, but that would be the goal, right? Is to have good communication with your clients. So later we're going to have a panel with 3 specialists, and so I thought I would hone in a little bit on how these things come into play, you know, with the various specialties. Family law has got to be, you know, one of the most complicated areas of practice when you think of it in the context of all of these things that I've, you know, mentioned before. You know, adverse childhood experiences, ambiguous loss, you know, trust issues that people have. And we know that there are layers and layers of implications when a family relationship changes so dramatically. And in my own experience, the failure of communication and the failure to recognize the impact on the children, by my own mother, really caused a lot of reverberations. And so I would put a poorly managed divorce in the earthquake category. In my own family situation, my mother's first divorce completely came out of the blue. The second one was just as unexpected. And then there are all these reverberations because you're disrupting the whole flow of life. You may be taking kids out of school. In my family's case, the second time, we moved across the country to a completely different culture, from Maryland to Utah, when people were saying, "Are you Mormon?" And we were saying, "What's a Mormon?" I mean, such a dramatic culture change with no warning whatsoever and no opportunity to really process. My mother's response was to 3 children who she was uprooting from high school to move across the country, who were pushing back. You see it all through rose-colored glasses. No, this is our life here. We do not want this to be disrupted. We don't know anything about that. And so if you're in a family law practice, if you can help your clients to understand whether they're the person who is seeking the divorce or perhaps the person who's resisting the divorce, that the implications of these decisions is far broader than on just them. Part of how we navigate change, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is to have a support system. So if you have a family who lives in a community and they have a church that they go to regularly that they're very involved with, the kids may go to aftercare at their school. They may have a favorite babysitter. They may have somebody who walks the dog when they don't get home on time. When you disrupt the family unit, when you move a family, you lose all of that support. And support is vital to navigating change. Support is vital to establishing the resilience muscles that we need to weather any of these storms that I've talked about here. And that's really what we're talking about here today, resilience. We hear a lot about it today because I think people are better understanding that we can't just mindlessly navigate life changes. We have to be more mindful of how we do that. And I would submit that family law is one of those areas where there are so many layers. The communication is just vital. But it's also an area where the emotions are just raging so often. And people lose sight of what's really important here because of their own wounded feelings, which are totally legitimate and warranted. But it can be about more than just them oftentimes. Personal injury is another difficult one. This is a sign that came about after a really tragic incident outside of the Twin Cities. Any Vince Flynn fans in the room? Okay, so Vince Flynn was sadly an author from St. Paul, Minnesota. I was fortunate enough to meet him, interview him, write about him. He wrote the foreword to the book that I authored. Great guy, died way too soon of prostate cancer a few years ago. Jake Flynn was his nephew, and he was one of 4 high school students who were playing a Nerf game in their car after school. And the reports are that Jake was sort of pressured into getting into this vehicle. 4 guys, 2 seatbelts, 2 deaths. Of course, it was the ones who didn't have their belts on who died that afternoon. And so with the personal injury case like that, again, like family law, there are just so many layers. The county attorney investigated and concluded that there wouldn't be criminal charges brought against the driver who survived. The family went on to establish a scholarship in Jake's name. It was anticipated that he was going to play college football. And so they wanted to do something. But if you think about how one incident like that, the bad decisions made by high school boys who just are not thinking clearly, can reverberate in a smaller community where you've got young teenagers now who have survivor guilt, the driver, the other passenger who was belted. You've got parents and school personnel, neighbors, people questioning, different accounts of what happened, how these boys ended up doing this. And that can really fracture a community. And so if you get involved in a case like that where maybe now there's a wrongful death suit, okay, because 2 boys died here, or there's a personal injury action brought by the surviving passenger, all of these relationships are now going to be implicated. You've got a community where people are used to sitting together on the bleachers at the football games. And now you've got 2 families who have lost their sons, who are still part of that community. And so having an understanding of the bigger picture can help us to, better facilitate that optimal outcome, talking about it and understanding really what are the motivations here. What is the best outcome here? If you're going to continue to live in this community, coexist with these people, go to church with them, go to school events with them, what is the optimal outcome? Taking into account all of the personal factors that go into play with something like this. Poor Tiger. It was a big fall, wasn't it, from that pedestal? A guy who worked his entire life to achieve a great, career, who has made some bad decisions and got himself into some real trouble. Fortunately, he had the financial resources so that, he's never going to be homeless. He's never going to want for, the basics. But when he was pulled over this last time, and it was found that he had different substances in his system, there were real ramifications there. But there's a fellow named Jim, who is a relative of a friend of mine, who had kind of a similar experience to Tiger. He was an over-the-road trucker, and he was at home drinking, had a couple of beers, 2, 3, maybe 4 beers, and his wife was ill, and she was kind of a difficult personality. I've been told she was kind of a battle axe, and she wanted him to go to the store and pick something up for her after he'd been drinking. And he resisted, but she persisted, and so he went. And just a couple of miles from his own home, he was pulled over because the vehicle had a broken taillight. And all of a sudden, Jim finds himself charged with driving under the influence. He loses his license. He loses his job. He loses his wife. And he loses his home. So if Jim comes into your office, how are you going to help him to achieve that optimal outcome? What is the optimal outcome for a guy who's lost so much? That's when we find ourselves in the throes of a why versus how conversation. When things like that happen to us, it's absolutely human nature to say, why me? Why now? Why not this other person? But why, if you're not Simon Sinek talking about finding your why is not useful when you're dealing with these kinds of problems. it just buries us. Like this guy who finds himself amidst the rubble. How is a much more useful three-letter word. How am I going to move forward? And that's where we circle back to expectations, communications, and trust. And that's really at the essence of that attorney-client relationship, right? Is setting the expectations, finding the best way to communicate, to learn as much as we can about the clients, and to ensure that we establish and don't violate their trust. Now, just like the little life raft that I showed you earlier, navigating these storms, whatever they may be, is just almost impossible to do alone. So we have to find strength through support. And this is a group of women who are breast cancer survivors who row. They're the Dragon Divas. And someone formed a group years ago to help women who survived breast cancer, like myself, to do something to focus on good health, to focus on moving forward. Not the why, but the how. Because we know that the better our health is, the better we're able to navigate all of the storms. And so with your clients who may come in and they may be the person with the help sign on their forehead, one of the most useful things is to let them know that they will be far more successful in whatever they have to do to move forward if they don't do it alone. If the problem is some sort of addiction, there are all sorts of groups out there that can help people. Whether it's Al-Anon for someone who might be a partner or a spouse of someone who's using, or Alcoholics Anonymous. There are lawyers groups that help people who have had difficulty with substances. There are online groups, there are Facebook groups. There are so many different ways that people can find strength by solidarity with someone else who has gone through what they've gone through. It may be a professional mentor relationship. Maybe somebody's got difficulties in the office. They're not sure that this is the right career for them. Finding a mentor can make all of the difference in the world, because it can just feel too overwhelming to try to navigate the hurricanes, the tornadoes, and the earthquakes on our own. And the two words that are probably the hardest to achieve, but the most important, are self-care. If we don't take care of ourselves, whether it's in a professional capacity, like you're here today, you're doing what you need to do to take care of your licensure. But if we don't take care of our health and our spirit, the ship's going to go down. And people will only send out that rescue boat so many times if they don't feel like people are taking care of themselves, making it a priority. And it can be as simple as going for a walk, having walking meetings. I went to the airport yesterday and I got there early and I had my bag with my laptop and my stuff and I just walked. I didn't have my Fitbit on, but I was conscious of trying to get as close to those 10,000 steps as I could. And what am I doing? I'm walking up and down the airport in Minneapolis, and I'm looking at people who are eating big slabs of pizza. Those are two fundamentally different choices that we make all the time. It's just something that we have to put in front of us. There was something on Facebook yesterday. My sister, who has a debilitating disease, says, I'm signing up for this plank challenge. You start off at 30 seconds, and you work up to 4 minutes over the course of a month. I said, I'm in. I can do that. But more importantly, she needs to do it. And so I'm offering her the support at the same time that I'm taking care of myself. It's all going to be much more manageable for both of us if we do that. And so as lawyers, we need to take care of ourselves. We need to get our exercise. We have to eat right, and we have to make sure that we're not relying on those substances too much to kind of get through this, the day and the career that takes its toll on us. Attitude is huge. This is a hurricane picture, still going. They're just being very defiant about it. Bob, Hugo, Fran, and David. I mean, that's a choice, right? Having that kind of attitude, the defiance. It doesn't matter how many storms are going to sweep into my life. I'm fighting back. I am not going to succumb. Attitude is something that we have to work at, just like everything else that we do. I ran across this sign in Spain when I did an 80-mile walk for Smile Network, where it was a fundraiser to walk 80 miles on the El Camino. And I saw this in the morning above a coffee shop, one of my favorite things. So I had to take a picture of it because it reminds us, if we smile, we're working those muscles. And it actually is something that some people have to really consciously think about. You know who they are. The ones you want to say, when was the last time you smiled? It's something we have to consciously work at. This is my girl on the right side here. She had a bone marrow transplant when she was 10 years old. Her brother was her donor. We're so lucky she's alive. She's 23 and she has had a lot of storms in her life. And yet she's got this incredible sense of humor. And her smile is contagious. She makes me smile. And she reminds me that we have a choice. We can start out the day and we can smile. Gratitude is sort of becoming a big buzzword of people hearing about gratitude. It's really an interesting phenomenon. It's not the same as manners. Gratitude is that sort of from the heart acknowledgement that we make a difference. Every day I try to think of something that I'm really grateful for. This is a woman who I met in Peru. I went on a mission trip with Starkey Hearing Foundation. I had written a story about them, and they invited me to go on a mission trip, and it was just amazing. I'm a big fan of mission trips. I think it puts everything in perspective, doing something for other people. This woman hadn't been able to hear for decades. And Starkey Hearing Foundation came in and I was able to put the hearing aid in her ear and two of her daughter's ears. They hadn't been able to hear each other speak for decades. And because this organization helps people around the world who want it to have the gift of hearing, she was able to hear. And she's old. She doesn't have many days left, but look at how grateful she is. She sat down and she sort of held court with people talking in her native language through an interpreter about how grateful she was that this organization had come in and done this for her. Think about the people in your life who show up in those rowboats. We're all old enough now that we've needed somebody, right? We've all had that neon, help me, kind of experience. I encourage you before the week is over. In fact, I'd say do it today, because if you don't do it today, you probably won't do it. Do two things. Take a moment and write down one thing that you're grateful for in your life. And then write a note or a letter to someone to let them know how grateful you are for some experience that you've had, something that they've done for you. Some moment where they came in that boat and they saved you. There's got to be at least one person in everybody's life. Because you'll make a difference in their lives when you express the gratitude. I've been on the receiving end of that as a columnist, and it's been a really interesting experience. I wrote my very first column for the St. Paul paper in 2010 on the occasion of my son's 16th birthday. And I was experiencing one of those waves of grief because I realized that unlike his peers and unlike his 3 siblings, he was never going to get his driver's license. And I remember getting my license and that sense of independence and, wow, I can do this. I can get myself anywhere I need to be. And I loved that. That was such a big moment in my life. And he would never have that. And so I wrote a column for the St. Paul paper, and I talked about just sort of that moment where you feel this sense of grief. And I talked about how hard it was to have a child with special needs who just required such a constant state of vigilance, because it just so happened that in a week's time, 2 little toddlers with autism had wandered off and drowned in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And those families weren't able to provide that nonstop state of vigilance is required and supervision, and that they lost their children. And so I wrote this piece that was published in the paper, and my email box filled up with people saying, thank you for sharing your story, because your story is my story. But I'm not a writer, and I can't express it. But you've given me this piece of work that I can take to my neighbor and show it to them and say, this is what it's like. And so that expression of gratitude has fueled me to continue to write about some pretty difficult things, including the memoir that I published a couple of years ago, where I shared a lot of the things that I'm sharing with you today. And it's not easy, but when people tell you that when you do something that's hard and it makes a difference, then it gives you that impetus to keep moving forward. So 2 things. What are you grateful for? And write a letter of gratitude to somebody. Those are your assignments. Action. I mentioned it. This fabulous woman is Tanny Austin. She and her husband Bill started the Starkey Hearing Foundation. She had her own adverse childhood experiences. We've become friends. I've written about her several times. They are going around the world nonstop, giving people the gift of hearing, establishing follow-up programs so that people can use the hearing aids and make sure that they can communicate. And they've met the Dalai Lama. He came to Eden Prairie, Minnesota, because he was so fascinated by the work that they do. Because the 3 steps to action to live the choice to be better are to look up, reach out, and step forward. When we're immersed in our grief, if we've had a death, when we're immersed in our grief because our marriages are falling apart, when we're feeling so blue because work is not going the way that we anticipated, it's easy to either literally or figuratively kind of crawl up into the fetal position. But there's no value, because then you're really focusing on the why. And what you need to do to move forward is to focus on the how. So you have to get yourself out of the fetal position. You have to get up. You have to turn off your phone. You have to get off the computer. You have to look up and engage. And then you have to reach out and make that connection somehow. Establish that support, whether you're giving or receiving. Giving is receiving. There's no downside to either. And then the 3rd step to action is to step forward, literally. Even the people who are going through the most difficult times can do something for somebody else. Walk a neighbor's dog if they're gone. Take a meal if they're going through chemo treatment. Take the kid to school if they've got an early morning meeting. We can all do something if we make it a priority. And it's so vital, because by doing for others, we take our minds and our hearts off of our own woes. And all of a sudden, you're finding that energy to move forward. And you're staying clear of that path that takes you down to bitter, and you're working more on navigating the path to better. And this is all true in our personal lives, and it's true in our professional lives. Look up, reach out, and step forward. Another vital tool to living that choice to be better is words. Everybody has a story. And by getting the story out in some capacity, whether it's writing in a journal every day, whether it's notes, whether it's poetry, it all helps to sort of have this cathartic experience, because when we're too bogged down by our history, we can't move forward. I took a memoir writing class a few years ago, and the room was full of people who had stories about adverse childhood experiences, ambiguous loss, death. They all thought, I need to publish my story. And it was just such an interesting moment, because I realized they're all just trying to sort of purge and move forward. Were all those books going to be published? Of course not. But was there value in the experience of getting the words out? Absolutely. Here's the other thing about words. As attorneys, that's what we're trained to use. Words are our tools, right? But we have to be very, very careful about how we use our words. Of course, words can win cases for us. They can lose cases for us. But if you think about words in the context of that personal dynamic that you have with clients, with colleagues, with family members, words can be weapons. Words can wound us. And I submit that it's the harsh words, the negative words, the loaded words that endure far longer than the words that are positive. I told you that in 1993 my son was diagnosed with autism. We took him to see a psychologist who contended that he had autism because my husband, who was a trial lawyer, and I were so busy working that we emotionally neglected him. She wrote it on paper. I've never forgotten that. She was one of 3 psychologists who we consulted with. Could I tell you what the others said exactly? No. But I will never forget that a psychologist who didn't know me accused me of emotionally neglecting my baby. So words matter. Choose them carefully. Now, life is about change, and anyone who comes into your office with that help sign in there is going to be a changed person in some capacity when they leave. Some change is unbidden. Some is predictable. We know eventually, we hope, that we'll be empty nesters if we're raising a family. Some change comes really unexpectedly. The law firm merges. You didn't know, you didn't see it was coming. The way that we view change has a dramatic impact on the way that we navigate change. I grew up not expecting all of these things to happen in my life, and I think that made it very difficult for me to navigate change. It made me a very closed-off person because I feared change, because change was always negative, hurtful. It caused pain. So it comes back to communication. If we're dealing with change in our lives, if we have people in our lives who are going to navigate change, the more we talk about it and help to prepare them for it, the more successful they will be at navigating it. It's the hurricanes, it's the tornadoes, it's the earthquakes. Think about the different ways that change comes into our lives. The more we can prepare, the better we'll be able to navigate change. We also hear a lot about stress. I'm so stressed. And it's become one of those things that we think about in a really negative way. Some of it we bring on ourselves. We don't say no to things that we should, right? We don't take care of things that we should. We don't communicate as well as we should. But now there's a whole different attitude towards stress. That stress is good. Stress gives us energy. Stress keeps the brain going. So we have to have the right amount of stress in order to be able to navigate the change and attend to the tasks that are before us in our lives. It's the way that we think about it. Now, I ran across this little tool, and I would say that this is something that I would encourage you to get something like this for yourself and to offer it for clients. I want you to think about something that you would consider to be very stressful in your life. Just take a moment and think of one thing that just really gets your blood pressure going. And now I want you to watch this and then see how you feel afterwards.
Take a deep breath in through the nose. Exhale through the mouth. and quiet your mind. Again, deep breath in through the nose. Exhale through the mouth. Relax. Quiet your thoughts. Quiet your mind. Again, deep breath in through the nose. Exhale through the mouth. Relax. Quiet your mind. Take a deep breath in through the nose. Exhale through the mouth and quiet your mind. Again, deep breath in through the nose. Exhale through the mouth. Relax. Quiet your thoughts. Quiet your mind.
I hope the people who are watching on the webinar haven't fallen asleep. How was that? Was it just relaxing? Does it just sort of help you to kind of take a breath in a moment? Throughout the day, think about that when you just are feeling really overwhelmed. You know, just try to remember that the breathing makes all the difference in the world. Well, I want to end here with just the final chapter of my personal story. I mentioned that I'd married a guy from Wisconsin who was a University of Wisconsin Stevens Point grad, trial lawyer in Minneapolis. He left us almost 8 years ago next month. The guy with a really, really big heart had a heart attack that he did not survive. And I found myself at that crossroads 4 months after he died, where I was that horse on my knees, wondering how my family was going to move forward. And I met someone, a priest at a social function, quite unexpectedly, where I started going into the why questions with him. Why my family? Why don't my kids have a dad? Why? And he just sort of stopped me and said, I can't answer the why questions, but I can tell you this. In the face of adversity, we all have a choice. We can be bitter or we can be better. So whenever I find myself at that crossroads, whether it's a personal matter, a professional matter, a family matter, whatever it may be, I remember Father Johnson's words, bitter or better. And I have done the things I've talked to you about today, the looking up, the reaching out, the stepping forward. I've written the gratitude notes. I consciously think about my attitude. All of those things have led me to a point where I am here today to share this with you because I really believe in it. And I know that we all have personal struggles as lawyers, whether it's in our personal lives or professional lives. And I want to share with you today the same gift that Father Johnson shared to me because it works if you work it. For you in your personal lives, for you in your professional lives, the gift of the choice, bitter or better. I've chosen better, and I hope you'll do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Caryn. All right, it's about 10:20. We'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll be back at 10:35. Those of you on the web, come back at 10:35. Thanks.
1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All good? Check 1, 2. Turn the gain up. It was way down from the computer. 1, 2, 3. There we go. 4, 5, 6. All good? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All good?
All right, we're back. 10:35. Thanks for rejoining. Second half of the program, we are going to apply a lot of what Caryn talked about in the first half of the program to the practice, and we have some practitioners who will be doing that for you. To my right, of course, is Caryn Sullivan, who you heard in the first half of the seminar. To Caryn's right is Gregg Herman. Gregg is shareholder with the law firm of Loeb and Herman in Milwaukee. He practices exclusively family law. He concentrates in cases with significant assets or income. Gregg is a 1974 graduate of the UW Law School. He is currently on the Board of Governors of the State Bar of Wisconsin, the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers, and the Wisconsin chapter of the AFCC. So welcome, Gregg. To Gregg's right is Chris Rogers. Chris graduated from UW Law School in 1995, where he was a note and comment editor for the Wisconsin Environmental Law Journal. After graduation, Chris worked for firms in Milwaukee and Madison, practicing insurance defense and defense litigation. In 1999, he began his work with Habish, and Rotier, and he is a shareholder with the firm. He is now in the Madison office. And at the far end is Steve Meyer. Steve had the privilege of being mentored in the art of criminal defense and trial advocacy by the late, great Jack W. Van Meter. A current adjunct professor at UW Law School, he previously taught evidence and trial advocacy from 1993 to 1999, and evidence from 2010 through the present. He is listed in Best Lawyers in America 2001 to 2017. So welcome, Steve. Steve and I go back a ways. Back in my early reporter days in the early 80s, I was one of those reporters stalking Steve when he had those high-profile cases at the courthaus. So we've aged a little and lost a little hair along the way, but
I've caught up to you, Tom.
Yeah. Okay. That's right. That's right. And you'll have to bear with me. I'm battling a little bit of a cold today, but I'm ready to get through it. I am Tom Watson. For those of you who don't know me, I am Senior Vice President at Wisconsin Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company. And again, I want to thank you all for coming to our fall seminar today, and thanks to all of you on the web. A reminder for those of you on the web, your question tab will get you in to the area where you can submit a question. So please do so. We will get it, and we will try to answer it when we do get it. So let's get started. I'm going to start with Gregg. Gregg, Caryn talked, she hit on a lot of topics that I think lawyers should think about that maybe they don't often do, and that is considering life experiences that clients bring into your office and things of that nature. You've been doing this for a while. I don't want to age you, but...
You're aged me 3 years. I graduated law school 77, so...
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, my goodness. Yes, okay.
Every year is important, Tom.
Okay, I got you. I know you have some at least, what you feel are pretty long-tested methods and procedures that you go through when you bring in clients.
Well, yeah, and I've come to conclude that the key to having a successful life, sane life, practicing law, and being able to maintain a sense of humor and integrity and everything else that's good and supposed to go with it comes down in the private practice to one key area, which is getting good clients, which is, some people are going to say easier said than done. It's sort of equivalent to the Steve Martin joke. What Steve Martin says, I'm going to give you lessons, teach you how to become a millionaire. Step 1, get $1 million. Well, it's sort of similar to that, get good clients, and everything else is done. So the question is, okay, if you do have good clients, it just makes, this whole practice a whole lot more livable, doable, and good. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you have to do, in my estimation, and I list in the material, I should say first, sort of the normal stuff. The stuff in terms of, don't be the second or third lawyer, and some other tips and general things. But I want to do a little more edgier in terms of the introduction to this part of the program, and be interested in Chris and Steve and Caryn's weighing in on it too, but at least in terms of my spin on it. And it starts with, you have to be able to define what is a good client. As there's a line in Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, how will you know when you get there? So you have to define what is a good client at the beginning, and I found the definition from a movie, because Hollywood is the font of all wisdom, of course, And the movie is a wonderful film called People versus Larry Flint. Anyone see that film? God, like 3 people. It's like it never, on reruns, it's never shown again. It stars Woody Harrelson, who in my estimation can do no wrong as an actor, playing Larry Flint, who during the course of the film is getting more and more difficult and more obnoxious. And there's a lawyer who starts his very young career representing him, and on as Larry Flint's getting more difficult. And there's a scene in the movie, and I have no idea if it happened in real life, probably not, but who cares? And the lawyer says, "I've had it, I'm firing you as my client." And Larry Flint character says, "You can't fire me." And the lawyer says, "Yeah, I can." He says, "No, you can't. I'm the perfect client. I'm rich, I'm fun, and I'm always in trouble." And that is the perfect combination. I'm very fortunate enough in my practice that I get some rich clients. I'm very fortunate that occasionally I have rich clients who are fun. They are never in trouble. And I tell the story about a case where I represented the wife. The husband sold his business, paid the taxes, and put millions and millions of dollars aside into a money market, sits down with his wife and says, "Hey, we're both unhappy, and there's about $60 million I've put in this money market. You take 30 million, I take 30 million, and let's just not fight about it and harm our children and run up huge fees." And she comes to me and I say, "I have no idea what I can do for you in this case." It's sort of like, I can't say, "Okay, we got 30 and a half." You know what I mean? It's like, okay, you think you can live on that, right? And she was a wonderful lady. He was a nice guy. They were rich, they were fun, but they weren't in trouble. And so you just do it and you can't make a whole lot of money. More common one, and I got a feeling Steve from the criminal side can relate to this a lot, is not rich, not fun, but always in trouble, right?
Well, I wouldn't say not fun. I live a very staid life, and I vicariously live craziness through my clients, which is sort of enjoyable and has maintained my marriage because I have no interest in doing the things that my clients do.
It all depends on your definition of fun to some extent
Right.
there too, doesn't it, Steve? So that's, as I say, I think it's most common to have not rich, not fun, and always in trouble. But you do get different permutations of that. I don't think I've ever seen a case where all 3 are true at one time, where you have rich, fun, and always in trouble. It tends to be, you get, if you're lucky, 2 out of the 3, and sometimes the wrong 2. Okay, so that's the perfect client. At least you know what the goal is. So how do you get there? And I have no answer to it. I've given the material some, the general concepts of what you do. But I heard a number of years ago a weighing test in terms of what you're looking at in terms of clients. And I think the older and older I get, the more it seems to me that everything in life is a weighing test, that there are very few things that are black and white and yes and no, and it's more judging, engaging percentages and odds and trying to do this weighing test. And so I think this weighing test fits in that real life experience very, very well. I do want to warn you that it does get, a little graphic in terms of language and concepts. So if anybody here has a high degree of sensitivity, it's a good time for a bathroom break. So you don't send Tom an email tomorrow and saying, "Herman offended me with this," okay? If you're easily offended, bathroom break time, okay? Or turn off your monitor if you or sound if you're watching online. So here's the 3-part weighing test that I read that I think works in terms of trying to make a decision as to whether clients fit that test. Weighing test number 1, you're not Jesus Christ. You don't walk on water, can't turn water into wine, you can't perform miracles. I heard a story when John Roberts was nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court that during his nomination hearings that someone told the story that he was representing a client before the U.S. Supreme Court as an attorney and lost the case when the decision came down 9-0. And the story is that Roberts called his client and he said, "I have very bad news for you. We lost 9-0. And the client said, how could we have lost 9-0? And Robert said, because there are only 9 justices on the Supreme Court. Okay, if there had been 11, we would have lost 11-0. Okay, I mean, sometimes you're just wrong. Sometimes it's just you can't change what the law is. That's what it is. And we're not going to change it as lawyers, and we're not going to do miracles. Weighing test number 2, which I don't know about you, Chris, but I know Steve will relate to.
Does that first one, is that tied into the initial communication with the client in terms of setting reasonable expectations and reasonable goals under the circumstances?
It is, and I'm interested in Chris's viewpoint on this one, because I think part of the problem we have in this is their expectations are somewhat shaped by mass media. And, no offense, Chris, to you and your firm, but they hear these advertisements from law firms about how they're all going to get them lots and lots of money, and all you have to do is make one phone call, and that's it. Is that the way that jingle goes? And
that's one of Chris's competitors.
And I know that. I know that. I know that. I know that. But the concept is that's how simple it is, and to make some lots of money. So yeah, I agree with you, Steve. That's the. It is a matter of the expectations being in line, but I think that people out there have expectations that are shaped partially in terms of the media, in terms of the advertisements and everything else that goes on, and partially just in terms of movies and TVs, where lawyers are dramatically sometimes in court winning cases through some brilliant argument.
Yeah, but I also run into, because competition in the marketplace is pretty significant, I'll run into potential clients that have talked to other lawyers who have guaranteed certain results. And usually my response to that is go hire them, because there's no way I'm going to guarantee a certain result.
I'm guessing in personal injury that's even more so, where the results can be quantified much easier than they can in my field and Steve's field.
Yeah, I mean, the key in my practice, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about client expectations as we proceed here, but the key is understanding what the client rightly or wrongly thinks you can do for them, and then educating them to great detail, quite frankly, initially, about what it is you can and cannot accomplish. In my practice, we're in the civil arena, but in my practice, there's also great trauma to the family, not just to the immediate family, but the extended family. And oftentimes, that group wants there to be a criminal aspect to the case. They have an expectation of, the pound of flesh idea. And so it's important for us, especially for me early on, to really understand exactly what they need from me, what we can provide them, and quite frankly, what the civil justice system can't to some of the family members or to them about punishment and those types of things. So when I meet the clients initially, depending on the case, depending on the severity of the injuries, depending on the complications, depending on those types of things, that initial intake can be a couple of hours.
Do they ever put pressure on you to approach the prosecutors about potentially charging? I ran into one of your competitors in a case in Jefferson who stuck their nose in significantly in the criminal case, and it feels dirty to me.
I don't know about pressure. They can oftentimes have trouble differentiating between the civil case that we're bringing on behalf of the injured family or the injured person and the role of the state that's having in the criminal case. So they will often ask us to be liaisons, to get information, to educate them, to explain to them what's going on. Why are these two tracks different? And we'll gladly do that. And in some instances, it's important to reach out to the district attorney or reach out to the state and try to get information to the family. I've had meetings where there's been a criminal aspect to it, a shooting, where we met as a family with the district attorney. He did a great job. He met with the family 3 or 4 times, kept them apprised of the criminal action, and that was very helpful. Generally speaking, though, it's really important, at least in my practice, right out of the gate to explain that this is not the criminal arena. And if you have expectations of punishment in the criminal realm, we've got to go somewhere else.
Now I got to ask you a tough question. Hey, you don't have to answer.
Buy low, sell high.
No, yeah.
At every chance.
I have run into the phenomena, although not with PI firms, but rather with insurance companies, where they'll finance the state experts in the criminal case. Has that crossed the line? I mean, for example, an arson case, frequently you'll see the insurance company actually hiring all of the expert witnesses for the state prosecution. Now, a certain good faith lawyer has tagged those insurance companies for doing that, but is that a line that's too far?
I've never seen that in my practice,
Okay.
and that's obviously concerning.
Yes, it's privatization of public prosecutions.
I've seen public experts being used in a private setting, but not in the underlying state's case, being funded by an insurance company.
You know, I think getting back to Steve's question in terms of client expectations, I think there are 2 things going on societally right now that the law society that has changed, at least in terms of the difficulty, because what we all want to do is give clients a reasonable expectation and saying, look, if you're, I think, forgive me, I think the PI one's much simpler than than mine, where I'm dealing with 30 different issues, and at least you're saying, okay, it's $100,000 for the accident. Okay, that's generally would give a range, something like that. And they say, well, some lawyer up the street said they could get me $1 million. Okay, and your response is, well, then, my response when I have people telling me stuff is 2 things: A, hire that lawyer, but B, before you do, get it in writing, so they can't deny later that they made the promise. But the 2 societal things that are going on that I think that are shaping that or causing that is A, the statistic is 22,000. That's the number of licensed lawyers that are licensed through the State Bar of Wisconsin. Wisconsin's a state of, 6-7 million people? 22,000 lawyers are licensed in the organization, the building we're in. That's a huge number. So there's huge competition for the cases out there. And the second I can't quantify, but I'll tell you it's usually someplace between $100,000, $150,000, or $200,000, and that's the amount of debt that kids graduate from when they were in law school. And at least when I was in law school, it'd be a joke. Most people didn't have any debt. But then again, my tuition in law school was, I think, I don't want to say, really show how old I am. And the combination of that 2, that A, there's a lot of competition. So if you don't overpromise, you're not going to get the case. And B, you need the case because you've got to start making those loan payments, I think cause pressure in terms of lawyers' judgment in shaping clients' expectations. You guys agree?
Well, yes and no. The State Bar, if you include non-resident lawyers, has a membership of about 25,000 people. I completely agree with Gregg that the issue of student loan debt is a significant issue that we've got to get our head around, and we're going to need help, quite frankly, to do that, to partner with the law schools. I mean, it's got to start there, and it's a big issue. There's huge debt. But as far as competition, obviously there is with those numbers. Those numbers are actually dropping, though. For the first time ever in 2016, the State Bar had a net loss of membership. And why is that? Well, because baby boomers are retiring. And the graduation rates are not matching the retirements. What does that mean? Well, that can be a problem geographically, and it can be an access to justice problem. And this gets back to the competition Gregg was talking about. We have our counties in our northern counties, north of Highway 8, in the not too distant future, many of those are not going to have enough lawyers or law firms to assist the public up there in handling legal cases. Right now, we're having difficulty, even our private public defenders taking on those cases up there. That problem is likely to worsen. And then, so what you have is you have 1 or 2 law shops or lawyers in our Northwoods doing everything they can possibly do, every type of legal work, because there's not a lot of choice, and those choices are dwindling. So that provides a whole nother issue as far as ethics and representation and pressure. So it's a complicated situation going on in the state right now.
The migration issue is very interesting because I don't think that's limited to the legal profession. I think that's true of a number of professions. That Dane County and Outagamie, I think, are the 2 counties that actually are drawing a huge migration in terms of professionals and just non-professionals to those 2 counties. The stress of the student loan debt is, I mean, when I teach at the law school, I sort of get a feel for it's bad. It's well over 100,000 for most. And they've taken loans to get through undergrad, and they roll them over, and then they're taking loans to get through law school. And I was talking to a student about something, and they go, yeah, I just took a loan, I bought a car, and so I can live outside of town, and I can commute. And I'm going, someday you're going to have to pay for all of that. But it ties in, especially in criminal defense, because I'll tell you what happens. Anybody who comes out of law school, if they can't get a job, they think they can hang a shingle and start doing criminal defense and take public defender appointments and make
do
a
personal injury.
and do personal injury. Right. It's sort of
You can
like
do that on the side.
I mean, isn't that easy? They went through the red light and they have a broken leg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the skill that's required? Yeah. And
One
divorce,
call, apparently.
hey, that's easy. It's 50-50 and
Yeah.
run the standards and doesn't take any talent
and
or experience.
And you know, there are consumers of the legal profession are price sensitive sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, others are like quality,
Yeah.
and you know,
Very much
I'm
so.
in a car crash.
Yep.
I want to buy a good car to be in that crash with. That's sort of the analogy I use. But you know, they go, well, how much do you charge for this? Well, wait a minute. I don't know the full extent of the problem, and they said, well, so and so down the street said they do it for $750. Well, go to them.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is there are a number of cases, I'm sure in all 3 of our fields, which doesn't require somebody with 30 years experience and a lot of gray hair, that few years out of law school you could probably handle fairly simply. There are a lot of divorce cases where people don't have lawyers, and it's perfectly fine. They don't really need it. It's the cases where they do and where the price becomes really price sensitive, where, you know, and I get the question, well, how much is this going to cost? And it occurs to me that if I needed significant medical care and on a difficult issue, the first question I'm going to ask my doctor is not going to be, what are you going to charge me? Now, maybe it's because I have insurance that covers most of it, maybe the reason, but the first question I'm going to ask is, have you ever handled this before? Have you ever cured this before? Do you have treatment for this? What's your experience with it? Do I need a specialist? You know, I want somebody who knows what they're doing, but I don't see that same sort of analysis in the legal system.
Well,
And-
there are, I mean,
Well, let me ask you guys, that when the client brings this kind of stuff to you, isn't it part of your job to, you know, Caryn was talking about clients have weathered many different storms in their life. That's why they're coming to you for the most recent storm or all of them cumulatively. So, and you know, the legal problem that you're trying to solve for them is not, maybe rarely is it really the end of the story, that there's more to it than just the legal analysis, right? So I guess 2 questions. One is, how do you bring the client back to how are we going to weather this storm, given all of the experiences and the baggage that you're bringing to this, as Caryn was talking about in the first half? And then also, how do we, I guess you were talking about the young lawyers, so how do we help mentor the young lawyers who maybe learned legal skills in school but not the human skills that Caryn was talking about?
Well, I'll start with the first one, and I'll let you guys deal with the younger lawyers, maybe. But the first one is obviously in terms of expectations, in terms of the client, talking to them, and the lawyers that do, and we see this a lot, do the 15, 20-minute consultations. I like what Chris said. You do a 2-hour meeting first. It takes that long to figure out what's going on beneath the surface, because it's like an iceberg where you're only seeing a little bit of it. You're never going to get down there. And the second is getting back to my 3-part test. Number 1 is you're not Jesus Christ, is accept your limitations. You're not going to cure all their problems. And I gave up a long time ago trying to. Now I'm just trying to help them a little bit, and hoping that little bit of help can be used to deal with the deeper issues and deeper problems.
Yeah, especially initially, I think it's very important, as I said before, to make it abundantly clear what you can accomplish for them and what you can't. That doesn't mean you can't advocate in the areas that you can't officially problem solve. We do that all the time. It's never one thing. It's always budget issues. It's always medical bills, coordinating insurance coverage with the provider. Do I have short-term disability? Do I have long-term disability? I'm going to lose I can't pay my mortgage. I can't do daily living in my home. I need help with my child because my spouse is injured. It's all of those things. So in my practice, it's extremely important, especially initially, to make clear what we can accomplish, but to also understand the issues that they're going to have as a result of the tragedy or the trauma. Try to identify those up front so that if I can't assist, some of my legal colleagues might be able to, and then partner with those. That's not a fee sharing or anything at all like that. I'm talking about, here's a problem you have. I know just the lawyer that might be able to solve that. I can't. And we try to get in front of that as soon as we can. And the big one that's very, very hard when you have a spouse, a father, a mother, the main breadwinner, is financing. I'm going to lose my house. My God, I can't let this happen. So we get in front of that as soon as we possibly can, and we don't always have great answers, but we work with them to try to get it solved. But expectations, understanding of what you can do and can't do, and partnering with other professionals that can help is key, and we try to do it up front.
I wouldn't say all clients, but a significant portion of clients who need representation in the criminal arena have mental health issues, substance abuse issues. And I went to law school. I have a econ undergrad degree. I am not a shrink. I'm not a counselor. But what I try to do is get the client tied into, you're employed, go to your employer assistance program, see if you can start getting counseling. Because number one, I don't have the time to work on that part and take your calls at 8 o'clock at night. That's what the mental health person is for. I have on occasion, although most clients are willing to undergo substance abuse treatment as part of the process, because you say, look, it's two benefits. One, it helps me get a better result. And number two, it helps you personally, because we don't want you to get back into it again. I have on occasions insisted that that's a condition of my fee agreement, which...
And part of being a good lawyer, am I wrong, that you need to, you said you're not a shrink, and we all understand that, lawyers can only do so much, but maybe Caryn, you can talk about, get back to where you were at the first half of the program, which was people come in and maybe they bring some Asperger's or they have childhood experiences, and so how do lawyers become multi-skilled to help identify the client's problems that maybe on the surface, a lawyer who's just looking at the legal problems, that's all they would see. But there's more to it. I mean, the Susan Boyle video, she walked out on stage and everybody saw a certain person, and there was much more underneath. So wouldn't she be like sort of the client who walks into the office and the lawyer now has to put away his or her initial judgments of that person and figure out, okay, what's beneath the surface? Am I right?
Well, one good way to learn about that is for those who are here today, because my experience and what I presented about was just life experiences, just to clue lawyers in that people all bring something, and lawyers all bring their own experiences, their biases, and so forth. It's a function of time, which isn't always easy to do, especially if you have clients who aren't able to pay. But I think just giving some time to really paying attention to what's going on in the world around us and learning more about the human elements, because I was a journalism major. I wasn't a business major, but I've learned through life's experiences, and each situation that we're presented with offers lessons if we can take a moment and try to drill down and really look for those. But things are often not as they appear with people, and just to try to suspend any judgments or preconceptions that we have based on, this is a cookie cutter criminal case or a family law case. Oftentimes there's a lot more that's beneath the surface, and the ideal outcome may not be what we imagine it to be. In a family law situation, maybe the most important thing is not how much money you get, but can we stay close enough together so that we can co-parent? It's really taking the time to ask the right questions and to discern what those issues are, and maybe what any sticking points may be. And I do think a big part of, from the client's standpoint, and a successful outcome is the clear communication and knowing that they can trust you and that the lawyer not violate that trust.
We talked how difficult clients are in the practice and everything. I was thinking when Caryn was talking that there's a positive aspect of all this too, which is the complexities that we're dealing with and how multi-layered the cases are, the clients are, is part of what should be the fun of doing this. I mean, if this was easy, and where's the challenge? And the challenge is these aren't correctable problems. There's no litmus test. There's no easy answer to any of this. It's all trying to do what we can do within the context of very, very complicated human relationships. Because human beings are complicated, the relationships are complicated. When we get into extended families, it's even more complicated. Katja? Oh, okay. That what makes it a challenge is to try to make things better for clients. We're not going to cure the problems. We accept that at the beginning, which is number one. You're not Jesus Christ. You're not going to perform miracles. But if we can make things better, do it in a positive approach, we're accomplishing a whole lot in terms of this. And the challenge is the fun part. If it wasn't a challenge, what's the big deal?
So my question is for Chris. A long time ago, when I was in private practice, I worked with a plaintiff's lawyer, and what really struck me about doing that work is that the more you convinced experts and ultimately the jury that your client was a ruined human being, the quote better close quote outcome in terms of a higher award. But what Caryn's talking about is how do you take a bad thing that happens to somebody and help them reframe it. So as a plaintiff's lawyer who is pressed by the system to make this plaintiff look like a real mess, how do you balance that life after the lawsuit?
Yeah, it's a difficult challenge. One thing that helps, I think, is to underscore the fact that you don't want to be defined throughout your lifetime by the tragedy or by the trauma. And initially, as I think everybody in this room probably has experienced, the tragedy or the trauma is as bright as the sun, and there is no way around it. It is taking up every aspect of the person's waking life. And one of the jobs that we have, I think, is to help them manage that perspective, to let them understand that there's medical professionals or whatever it is that can help them walk through the difficult walk they have in front of them, and then to kind of educate them as they do that from a mental health perspective. Do not let it define your life existence and your waking hours. And as we go through the process, that's an important part of our advocacy for them, to give them perspective. And with regard to the experts, let them know that your life is going to continue and it's going to be fulfilling. And with regard to trying to maximize compensation, the point there is the idea that these runaway verdicts are baseless is, quite frankly, pure fiction. That just doesn't happen. What we try to convey to juries and to everyone else is this is a person that just is looking to be treated fairly in compensation, in respect, in their life choices going forward, even if they have a disability that is a result of trauma. So it's really just an act of fairness that we're looking for from a compensation standpoint. And to get to that process, do our best to not let the accident or the injury or the product define them as a person. And if you can do that, you've gone a long way of being a good advocate for them.
Well, I think that goes, Caryn, to your better, not bitter message, right? That sounds like, not letting these things define who the client is, taking a different approach to it.
Well, and I think that you're kind of dancing on the head of a pin, because you may have a client who has been in a serious accident and, so many layers of their lives are implicated and nothing will ever be the same, and they may need the financial resources to move forward to, have the best outcome possible. And so to achieve that, you have to put your worst case scenario ahead of you. I mean, I have a son with autism, and, there was one time where he was going to be evaluated, and I actually gave him Mountain Dew ahead of time. I wanted him to be as hyper as he could for this interview, because I wanted to make sure that he got that diagnosis and that it stuck. And so sometimes you do what you need to do. But it strikes me that, when you're dealing with clients, you want to find out as much as you can at the outset, set the expectations that are reasonable. And then when you're finished, I love the way that you talk about the tragedy or the trauma not defining them, helping them to say that this was sort of a moment in time that we had to present this side of you, but now you have a choice about how you move forward. And, these are the tools that you can have, and the things that I talked about earlier, having the support system, not trying to go on your own with it. Doing the self-care, which is so important, making sure that you use the resources that you get to support the family. If it's the wage earner who is injured and, can't go back to work full time. One of the things that I regretted as a mother of a son with autism is that I didn't get enough help when he was younger, because the ripple effect on the whole family unit is so significant. You have multiple children, but all the attention is paid on the one whose needs are the greatest. Trying to find that balance so that the family unit remains intact after the tragedy is, really vital as well. And in terms of expectations, I always think about, my late husband used to say, he was a trial lawyer, 70% rule. If you get 70% of whatever it is you want, whether it's in your job, your relationships, your home, or whatever, that's good. And the kids and I would all be like, we hate that, 70%. But, the older I get, the more I think, he may have been onto something, So you've got to come up with your number for your clients.
Well, and just one quick comment. I mean, with regard to my fairness statement, that's how we frame it. Obviously, we have a duty under the ethics rules to zealously advocate for our clients and for their best interests and exits at the end. And my firm certainly does that when we're trying to seek compensation for injuries. But we can still frame it as a fairness issue of what they need and what they deserve and what they have to have. And it's a question of fairness for them. But you can zealously advocate to that end and frame it that way.
I want to pose that same question to both Steve and Gregg, because I think in criminal law as well as in family law, it's the sentencing argument that you make about my client recognizes that was a terrible mistake, and these are the steps they're taking to improve themselves. In family law, you can't go into court and argue that your client is just ruined by this marriage and will need to be paid forever because they're totally incapable of taking care of themselves. So I would like each of you to also talk about how you counsel your clients in this regard about take this bad thing and move forward.
You framed it sort of wrong in terms of my situation. To those clients that get acquitted, charges dismissed, that's a talk you can have with them. I mean, with CCAP and other public databases, the fact they were accused will follow them unless I can do certain things that are available to get it off of the various databases. But it's also when you have the client who goes to prison. Look you're going to get through this. And you're going to be able to reconstruct your life. But it's not, there's never a sentencing argument that's woe is me. I mean, and I don't mean to say your approach is woe is me, but look
Never is. Because if it is, it's not successful.
Exactly. And that's true for a client who's been accused of a crime. It's never woe is me. As a matter of fact, that type of narcissistic approach will ensure that you get 20 rather than 10. Narcissism is a problem with a number of clients in the criminal defense arena. And the focus has to be, I want to improve society, I want to make amends, I want to change the outcome for the victims to the best I can. But in terms of them, I'm not framing them to say, oh, this is terrible. I'm framing them to say I've taken steps to address the problem that caused me to be here. And because I'm addressing that problem, I won't be a recidivist, and I'm going to be a contributing member of society.
We do run into a number of clients who have various degrees of depression, and sometimes it feels like they're a black hole and they're just sucking everything good into it. And it's very difficult. Fortunately, there's some medications that are very effective with it. But if it's a very severe depression, you get into what Katya's saying, this negativity that I'm harmed, I've been hurt, and I'm always going to be hurt, and I'm always going to be a victim of it. I think it's bad for the client because there's a whole life that they're going to have after we're done here. In my field, it's doubly bad because if there are children, and it doesn't matter if the children are minors or adults, either way, they're going to have a future with this other person in their life. And to have this constant victimization that I've been permanently harmed for it is something that makes it more difficult to deal with the other person who feels or is actually being blamed for everything that happened. And lastly, I don't think it makes a good presentation in court. Maybe in personal injury, there's no other way of doing it except to say my client's been harmed and it's permanent harm and he or she'll never get better. But I think it's a far better, in my field at least, a far better position to say, yeah, my client stayed home and raised children for the last 20 years, and that created significant detriment in terms of her, today's world, a lot of times his income-producing ability. However, if he or she gets assistance from the other party for a period of time, here's what he and she can do, and present a plan. And we've done this. Here's a plan of action. Here's what he or she's going to do. Here's the courses, the remedial courses. Here's the time it's going to take. And I think courts are much more likely to help somebody who says, give me some help and I will use it to become self-sufficient or as self-sufficient as I can, as opposed to somebody who says, poor me, help me because there's nothing I can do, I'm just pathetic maybe.
And there was another point that I missed, and that is during the sentencing process, you're focused on having family members, friends, members in the community step up for your client and say, this is not a fundamentally bad person. So we aren't getting that initial negative vibe. You're doing everything positive possible during the criminal process to look at. Part of the defense is based on the law, part of the defense is based on the facts, and part of it is advertising or how you package your client. And the packaging is a positive reinforcement of your client. So you aren't getting this negative drawdown at all.
Caryn mentioned attitude as well in her presentation, and I think you guys have touched...
Whose attitude?
Well, let's start with the client.
Oh, okay.
You know, and I guess what I'm getting at is and I think you guys are talking about it too, and that is, do you work on shaping their attitude when you're talking about sort of rehabilitating them to get their life back in order? I did family law for a few years, far less than what Gregg has done, but one of the clients I will always remember is a woman who, you know, she came in and so I started working on the legal issues in the divorce, and then it became clear that her issues really had nothing to do with her husband. It was more, you know, she had gotten lonely and depressed, and she started calling me at about 4:45 every afternoon because that's when she got home from work. And she would tell me about the gazebo that she's having renovated in her backyard and all these things. And so I would listen, and it became clear she just wanted someone to hear her and listen to her. She wanted a friend. And, you know, at some point I said to her, you know, I'm happy to talk about this stuff with you. I do have to bill you for some of this time that we spend together, and because I pretty much had written most of it off. I didn't bill her for any of this, and she said, oh, that's fine, bill me whatever you want to bill me. I'm fine with that. And you know, she kept calling, and I guess long story short, it became clear to me that my job here was to try to get her feet back on the ground and help her move on from what she perceived as first of all a husband who abandoned her basically. And you know, she brought in photo albums. She showed me pictures of when she was younger, and she was clearly at a point in her life where she had kind of given up. And the pictures were of things, you know, she was a very vibrant woman in her early years. She volunteered and did so many things in the community, and now she was basically a shut-in. She just didn't do anything. So I guess what I'm getting at is, as a lawyer, if you want to be a really good lawyer, you recognize some of that stuff in your clients, and while you can't solve all the problems, as you say, Gregg, you can at least identify them, as Caryn, I think you were getting at, and figure out, you know, what kind of help can I provide? As we all know, you get out of law school and you realize, especially in family law, you aren't just a lawyer, you're a family advocate, you're a psychologist sometimes.
Sometimes more so than anything else.
Yeah, you almost help raise their kids sometimes, you know, and that's the other thing. You know, so many of my cases, I saw the kids were the ones who got hurt the most, and so you're trying to, you know, I felt sometimes I had to step well beyond what I was really hired to do, and figure out, okay, what kind of a person can I be for this client, as opposed to just being a lawyer.
Yeah, and there's a line there somewhere, and you have to find it in each case, and experience is really helpful in this. But the line is between treating the client only as a conduit to a bill to help pay your rent and your student loan, and caring about them as a person beyond the case, but not caring so much that they become a personal friend, in which case you lose perspective, or even more than that, as sometimes happens in this field. And it's not an easy line to find in every case. But if you treat them only as a case, only as a client, even though it does reduce their fee because you're spending time efficiently, and there's a certain part of you that wants to say, hey, you know, I don't want to do stuff without billing, but if I bill for stuff that really isn't necessary, they're not going to want to pay it, and I'm wasting my time. There's a certain point where you sort of have to do that to a certain extent to make the person feel that you understand and care about them in a whole, I think in medicine they call it holistic medicine, sort of a holistic law sense in sort of a larger general sense. And at the same time, you have to maintain perspective and objectivity. I spent a lot of my time telling clients what they should hear, not what they want to hear. And I have a standard line, which is if you go see a doctor and you'd like to hear, oh, you've got the flu, you'll be fine, don't worry about it. But if you have cancer, you want to be told, you have cancer, here's the treatment I recommend. You want to hear the truth even if you don't want to hear it, along with a treatment plan for it if it's really bad news. And if you lose that objectivity, you're not going to be able to tell clients what they should hear as opposed to what they want to hear. They're getting a lot what they want to hear from friends and family anyway. Everybody's out there talking to everybody else, going online, reading stuff, family members, everybody knows somebody who's a lawyer, and they're all telling them everything that they want to hear in terms of how aggressive they ought to be in the case, how much they should fight, what they should expect, and all of this. As a lawyer, it's part of our job to take a step back and give them some of the bad news in terms of the objectivity. I've often thought that my next life, I want to work for the Wisconsin Lottery Commission. So all I do is call people and say, you won $100 million. Thank you. I have a nice life with it, as opposed to constantly calling people with bad news.
Or if you work for the Iowa Lottery, you have to hire me. But that's neither here nor there.
Why is that?
Well, they all got indicted for fixing the numbers. But anyway.
I just want to jump off just quickly on Gregg's point was a great one, and it started with Tom talking about, you know, attitude and whether we can actually affect change in our clients' attitudes and conceptions of the claims. And I think you can, and I think there's a need to do that depending on whether you're educating them about outcomes, whether you're educating them about the process. There's certain attitudes that I think we've seen with all of our clients that we need to kind of manage and potentially shape or change. That can't happen unless the client trusts you. If there is no trust there, you are never going to effectuate change in attitude. And one of the ways to garner trust is do what exactly Gregg was talking about, is along with supporting and being an advocate, is to tell them the truth and to tell them the things that they should hear and need to hear, not what they want to hear. That's a big part of, I think, is part of my practice. The other side of that coin is appreciate and understand what we cannot control and change. And there are some attitudes, some issues that our clients have, whether it's just their core person or their core belief, or whether it's things Caryn was talking about earlier in the seminar about what they bring to the table, where we will not be able to affect change in those areas. And so then it's our job to manage that. And whether that's managing it at trial or a deposition or in a conference call or on their living room couch, that's part of the challenges we have, because there's some things that we're not going to be able to affect.
One of the fun things, sort of some positive stuff here, is when you've been doing this for enough years, every once in a while you run across somebody who represented many years ago, and they'll say, you know, you said such and such to me, and it really, really made a difference or helped me. And sometimes what they repeat is something I actually did say, you know.
Well, at least you remember.
At least I remember it, yeah. Well, no, I can remember.
I don't remember anything I told clients back in the 80s. I'm sorry.
Loss of memory can be a good thing too, huh? But it's a really nice feeling when that happens, and you know you actually did say it, and somebody listened. Because, of course, my kids have never listened to anything I've ever said. It's never made any difference to them. And when they say that to you and said that really's made a difference in my life and what you did, and boy, that's a really great feeling.
I'd like to just add that a lot of times, I think especially in the personal injury arena where people, might lose a limb or lose their help or whatever, you see so often people who, like myself, find purpose in the pain and go on to do something. In Minnesota, I assume Wisconsin is similar. We have so many nonprofits, people who have just had a lot of pain in their lives, who have gone on to help other people. We've got the Jacob Wetterling Foundation, that came about after Jacob disappeared. And, that's how his family has moved forward. Not to say that we need one more nonprofit, but there are enough out there where people can help, where they can contribute their time and, jump into that, that lifeboat that, I showed on the screen earlier. And, to that point too, I think that it's useful to offer people resources in a sort of delicate way, maybe framed in terms of some of my other clients have tried this and it's been really effective for them. It's a fine line there. I remember when my son was young, after he'd been diagnosed with autism, and I would talk to my girlfriends and they would just be throwing their hands up. They didn't know what to say, and so they would say, well, maybe you should find a support group, which felt very dismissive to me. But I think couched differently in terms of other people have found this to be really useful, then it doesn't feel like a brush off, and it feels like you're being offered another tool in your tool belt to become resilient, because that's really what all of your clients are required to do, is to move through some kind of challenge or change, and hopefully stronger than they entered it.
And not just our clients, but us as well. There's plenty of opportunity to do volunteer work. There's a legal clinic in Milwaukee that I've volunteered for years and years. And you do stuff like that. I've served as unofficial counsel for Make-A-Wish Foundation for a number of years now, when they have a couple that's divorced or their problems, and and it's pure pro bono work. I know it's easier for me to do because I don't have $150,000 student debt staring me in the face. But not just for the clients to do it, but also for the attorneys, if you can take what you do and also do some good. And there's a lot of good to be done out there in the world with these nonprofits. It's a heck of a good feeling.
Catch.
I have another question for each of actually all four of the panelists. You each, because of the work that you do, you absorb a lot of pain. You learn some really awful, horrible things that have happened to people, and you use your professional skills to help them get through that. But it's really what Gregg is talking about. What do you do for yourself to counter that?
Well, I'll start, because I wanted to follow up on one of Gregg's comments about the line. Number one, I make it a point that I have two separate existences. I have my legal practice and I have my personal life. No client is a personal friend. That is a line that I have drawn. I don't go hunting with my clients. I don't go fishing with my clients. I don't go into business with my clients. That is a line in the sand for me. I wanted to ask the panel how many give their cell phone numbers out to their clients. I refuse to do that because I tell them there's not a problem I cannot address the next day during work hours. And I said, if usually I'm not worried. There are exceptions to every rule, but I'm not worried about an arrest in the middle of the night or a search warrant being executed in the middle of the night by the time I've been hired. I mean, I may have been called in on an emergency over the weekend, that type of thing. But once I have the situation stabilized, look at no calls at home. That is my personal life. So I have really drawn a line in the sand. Now, I do take work home, and my wife is very compassionate, and I make sure I don't violate the privilege. But my family has been very supportive of what I do. So much so my daughter said when she went to law school, the last thing I want to do is what Dad did, and what is she doing exactly what I have done?
That's a tough question, and I don't have a cookie cutter answer for it. I think we all struggle with it. One comes to mind. I had a case, a tragic case, and I'm not going to sit up here and tell you war stories, but I had a tragic case involving the drowning of a 4-year-old boy, and this beautiful young boy drowned at a water park in Wisconsin Dells. And that water park advertised nonstop every night for the 3 years I had that case. So I would be sitting at my kitchen table and I would see the water park ad, and I wouldn't think of the water park. I'd think of the young boy. So we can escape some of this. If we do, I don't think we're probably very good at what we do. So I try to separate as well. I'm not quite as successful. When you travel,
I'm not claiming success.
when you travel a lot, sometimes the cell phone is a necessity with the client. But one of the things that helps me in these really difficult cases is when I can try to affect change in their attitude and really make a difference beyond whatever the financial outcome is in the case, is really move them forward mentally and in their lives in some way. And then the other thing that helps is if you can look back when it's done and really recognize I made a positive difference in that family's life, and that was a privilege to do, that helps a lot. That doesn't necessarily help when you're in the middle of the storm and you're seeing the ads 3 times a night. But at the end, at the finish line, if you can turn around and see that you effectuated positive change, that helps you do the next one and the next one. But that's a tough question to answer.
One of the rules we've had in our office, and very consistent with what Steve said, is everybody's home at night for dinner with their family. And the only time anybody's in the office on a weekend is if there's a trial, or if I was out of town the previous week, got back Friday night or something like that, then I may go in on a Saturday or whatever. But otherwise, that's the rule. And we limit and restrict clients that we'll accept as a result, because we get too busy, you can't do that. And I'd made the choice, the personal choice, to make less money and spend more time with my family. And there's an old line that goes that nobody ever said on their deathbed, I wish I had spent more time in the office. And that line to be drawn is very, very critical. And I found the answer on the cell phone question, Steve, a really easy one, which is I just don't turn it on evenings and weekends. I'll give it to anyone. You want my cell phone number? I don't care. I just don't turn it on. 5 o'clock, 5:30, it's off. And I don't turn it on weekends at all. It drives my wife crazy, but so many other things I do drive her crazy as well. It's just one more in the list, you know. And so if clients want to call me, that's fine. And Monday when I turn it on, maybe there's a voicemail, and like with Steve, I'll return the call then. But you need to draw that line. You can't restrict other things, such as the TV commercial, from interfering and for occasionally thinking about it. So like everything else we've talked about, it's a matter of degree.
Caryn, what are your thoughts on?
Well, on cell phones, I have people I do business with who give me their cell phones, and I find all of a sudden there are no lines. And so I would never do it as an attorney unless I absolutely had to, because then I think you have no life. How to deal with all the stories and the personal challenges people have, like I said earlier, I think doing for others. For me personally, that has been a huge antidote to personal heartache, and it's truly amazing how gratifying it is to do things for other people. How you can get immersed in some cool activity and not think about what's going on in your own life. For me, physically doing things has been great. I mentioned I did 80 miles on the El Camino to support Smile Network. I had to train for that. I traveled with friends. I established new relationships, went to a new part of the world, and it was all really gratifying. Having said that, I realized that especially, clients, aren't always in a position to do that. But I do some kind of volunteer thing every month, whether it's going to some kind of a benefit, handing out T-shirts at a race, making a donation to somebody on Carrying Bridge, whatever it is. That's just part of how I now live my life, and it works.
Do you guys have? I assume you have outside interests that you try to separate yourself from your work.
Absolutely.
We've talked about this at many different presentations about.
Well, but if there's any, athletic type stuff like biking or competitive tennis, things like that, you can walk away from what you're doing temporarily.
And isn't it true? I mean, we've gone through this over the last probably 10 years or more as we do these programs. It's evolved into this discussion. Lawyers always talk about, how different, 20 years ago, we didn't have these issues of disconnecting from the office because there was no way to reach you unless you needed to be reached, right? Somehow
Right.
you arranged ahead of time. Now with cell phones, as Katya's mentioning, texting and the cell phones. And so we often get into these discussions with lawyers about how do I disconnect from the office, because I find myself working constantly. And that goes to Katya's point, which I wanted to get to, and Katya, thanks for getting there for us. But how do lawyers, maybe Caryn, you can address this first, how do lawyers maintain their healthy well-being, emotional state? Because lawyers usually see themselves as the problem solvers. They don't often think that they can turn to others for help because they're the helpers. And do they not sometimes miss that part? They don't realize what it's doing to them?
Well, it comes back to self-care and being conscious about having things in your life that bring you joy and are good for your health. Like I said, my husband was a trial lawyer, died of a heart attack at 54. He had 7 stents in his heart when he died. And he just always was like, no, I can't have a bypass because I couldn't take that much time off from work. That comment was made about 2 months before he died. So you just have to make your priorities, and you have to live the priorities. And it's like the expression, if mama goes down, the ship goes down. And I think that's true regardless of whether you're male or female. You've got to make your personal health a priority.
So we have about 5 or 10 minutes to go. And first of all, if you have any questions, get them in now. And for those of you on the web, if you have some, please send them in, because so often we run into a case where we get the email question and we've concluded the program, so we can't answer it. So get them in now. I wanted to mention one other thing and have you guys address this. I was reading an ABA article last night, actually, as I was looking through a lot of this material. And they were talking about the skills that they don't teach you in law school, and we've covered a lot of them today. And one of them was listening, and that lawyers aren't trained to be good listeners. And I think all of you at some point have touched on how you've had to be a good listener. Otherwise, you will miss some of the messages and the flags or the sensitive areas that your clients need you to be aware of. So how important is listening in your practices? And then Caryn, maybe you can talk too about if there are things lawyers should think about in terms of becoming good listeners and not always being the one to tell the clients how this will go, and maybe being able to sit back and let the client talk and communicate to them.
My experience many years ago was being guardian ad litem for a child with 2 nice parents, but both wanted maximum time. And I hired a mediation team in Waukesha at the time named Mimi and Chick Nickel. They're both passed now, who did mediation before anybody knew what mediation was. And I used to send them all my cases because they always solved it. And they called me and they said, we can't solve it, this case. And I said, my God, it's got to be two nice people, and I'm guardian litem for this child I want it solved. And they said, well, here's what we're going to do. We have permission for both of them for you to sit in on the next mediation session. It's going to be at 5 o'clock at our home. They were living together. And I said, okay. And they said, there's one thing, though, Gregg. You can't talk. And I paused, because if there's one thing I'm not real good at, it's not talking. I mean, there's a lot of things I'm not good at, but not talking is one, excuse me for the double negative. And they said, you're just going to sit there, because you're essentially a chilling factor to keep them on path. And you have to sit there and just listen. So I showed up there, and what I realized is what happens, and probably true of us on the panel as well, we listen to each other and all this, and then we're thinking at the same time of what we're going to say next, how we're going to respond. And I realized that with my clients and also my personal life, a lot of times I'm thinking of what I'm going to say in response, which means I'm missing half what was said. And it was a fascinating experience. I did it with Mimi and Chick about 4 or 5 times after that, and it was a wonderful learning experience. And I quote the greatest American philosopher of all time. I refer, of course, to Yogi Berra, who among the things he did or did not say, nobody knows, is you can hear a lot if you listen, or you can listen a lot if you hear. It was one of the two things, but it's you can hear a lot if you just listen. And boy, is that ever true.
Just briefly, a couple of points. I learned that if I'm going to be a good listener to my clients, I needed to exhale and actually not be worried about the 5-minute or the 10-minute or the 20-minute phone call that this was going to take out of my life, because it's all about me after all. And so that's the first thing that I had to learn, is exhale and actually be in the moment with this client and try to figure out what he or she is telling you and whether you can help it. And another thing is active listening. I mean, when I prepare my clients for deposition, the thing that I tell them, there's a handful of rules that we go through, and the biggest rule is that I try to convey to them is that this is not a speaking exercise. You're thinking that you're there to tell your story, and you've got this tremendous story to tell, and it's full of emotion and pain. And it is first and foremost, a deposition is a listening exercise. You have to be there. You have to actively listen to what the question is. You have to understand it, and then you need to answer it. And when I am harried and busy and don't have time for a call, or I'm juggling too many things, I exhale and I take my own lesson with the client, and that helps. Those are the couple of points I have.
I have a saying that I use periodically, and it's more of a sarcastic comment about other lawyers who do the type of work I do. And I frequently say, it's amazing the things you learn when you actually talk with your client. And I will shift gears, however, and talk about personal greed. I am forced to listen because I have to figure out what my fee is going to be when I'm talking to the person. And I have to pick up the tells, what are the problems, etc. That's one part of the conversation. Or one goal is, I'm going to be quoting a fee when this is all said and done. I don't want to get in upside down. So there's a personal greed aspect to listening carefully. The other is, the client has an expectation that you will be able to develop some type of plan, approach to the problem. And I can't develop or even start to outline in my head what that plan is going to be unless I've heard them. So it's sort of, I didn't have the experience of being forced and sit and listen, or some of those types of things. It was economic necessity and legal necessity, in other words, to do the best job I possibly could, that sort of forced me to listen at least to the tells. And I was going to ask you about that, if each of you sort of have tells that occur, that the client rubs their nose and they're holding the ace of hearts. But there's certain tells that you try to pick up on in terms of assessing the case and a client.
I read somewhere that mental health professionals say that communication is 80% nonverbal. And I may challenge the specific percentage, but I will occasionally, if somebody lives out of town, do the initial consultation by phone if I have to, but I much prefer to do it in person.
Right.
And I also like one of the things that Chris said, doing the lengthy one, I do it on a flat fee, so there's no pressure in terms of time, because there isn't always that obvious to tell, but nonverbal communication is really, really important.
Okay, final takeaway to our viewers on the web and to those in the room. I'm going to start with you, Steve. We'll work down the table. What do you want people to take away from this today in terms of the message on how you can be a fully rounded advocate and lawyer for clients, not just with their legal problems, but helping them navigate the challenges, the tragedies, the issues that they are bringing to you, that they are currently dealing with in their lives?
I think Chris's comment of learning to exhale is extremely important. Society moves, Alan Toffler, Future Shock, it keeps moving faster and faster, and client expectations are immediate gratification, immediate answers, immediate responses, and that just ain't so in terms of doing a good job. Sometimes you need the time to slow down, reflect, think about things, and combine that with make sure you keep a personal life and enjoy the things you do on the side, because being well-rounded, I think, is extremely important in terms of rendering quality service to your clients. To be knowledgeable about a million different things, we're jack of all trades, masters of none, is something that you want to make sure you continue to do.
In a word or two, red wine. Go red wine. Just, you know.
This is Wisconsin. I thought it was all about beer.
That's true. I think for me, with regard to my practice, the key is managing client expectations and educating them on the process and having them appreciate what you can and cannot do for them throughout the process of resolution. And you know, information and knowledge is power, and they feel like you're a good advocate for them, you're taking care of them, you're taking care of their case if you spend the time to lay out exactly what you can do, and for the things that you can't do, you try to get help elsewhere. But you make it clear what you can and cannot do, and then you keep them informed along the way. You have informed clients that at the end then really appreciate your advocacy, and that gratitude and that good outcome is what charges your battery for the next one. And obviously you need to find time, and I'm poor at that, and I imagine many of us are, but you need to find time away from the office. I have a wonderful wife, and I've got a senior and a sophomore and an 8th grader and a dog in my house, so I've got a lot of good things there. But you got to find whatever it is that benefits you and gives you enjoyment outside of your practice.
But your daughter's birthday was Sunday and
Monday,
and you were home for that.
I got home for that.
Okay, that's good. So you're practicing what you preach. Great.
I just agree with everything that Chris said, accept the limitations. It's a complex world, and these are complex people, but embrace the fact that within that limitations, there's some really positive things you can do and make a huge difference in people's lives, but you can't do that unless you're good for yourself. So if that requires, if there is a substance abuse problem, stay away from that red wine. Go to the non-alcoholic beer, okay? If there is a depression and you need to get treatment or help for, then go do it. And in terms of the private life, the nice thing I can tell you, being a lot older than Chris, is that these kids that you're bringing up that are creating all those worries and difficulties eventually do a wonderful thing. They made us grandparents. We can't believe it. And boy, all of life all the problems have been worth it up till now, and hopefully get a few bucks left aside to have fun with them.
I would say really reflect on what constitutes an optimal outcome when you when a lawyer and a client come together. They may well not get the monetary judgment or settlement in their PI case that they had hoped for. They may have to serve a little jail time. They may not get the dog or the house or whatever it is that they're battling over, but whatever brings them to you is the storm that they are experiencing at that moment, and it will pass. But what they're left with is that choice, about how they're going to navigate that storm and any future storms, because they're part of life's promise, and that they have a choice. They can be bitter or they can be better.
We have 3 questions on the web, and so let's get to them real quick. The first one, Gregg, this viewer said that you had 3 points you wanted to make. One was you are not Jesus Christ. They did not get numbers 2 and 3.
This is with go to the bathroom now if you don't like being offended. Stuff. This is when it gets a little edgy. Number 2, you can't shine shit. Okay? I don't think I need to explain it to anyone. Steve, you need to weigh in on that at all? Because you see shit all the time, right? Okay.
Not my clients.
Everybody else's. And number 3, which somewhat contradicts 1 and 2. So 1 is you're not Jesus Christ. Number 2 is you can't shine shit. And number 3 is a little more complicated one, which is you can't dance with your legs crossed. Meaning if you want to get involved in the dance, you're going to represent that client, get involved in the legal system, you have to uncross the legs, and I'll leave it up to your imagination as to what the risk is when you uncross your legs. You can't do this without a certain amount of risk. With risk comes the opportunity for return, so keep that in mind as well.
Okay, next question. What have each of you learned from a female, minority, or junior attorney, or all 3?
I'll say from a minority attorney. A number of years ago, one of the attorneys here in the room with me, Gretchen Viney, and I were putting together some programs for guardians ad litem, and minority attorney approached me and said, when you're doing that, there are a lot of cultural differences that you have to keep in mind and need to be presented. And I learned a tremendous amount from that people aren't uniform, and some of the differences do deal with cultural differences. And as lawyers and representing a lot of different types of people, we need to know those and learn those.
Yeah, I'm going to echo that. I mean, minority and female colleagues and associates and partners in my firm perspective. There is more than one way to look at something, and quite frankly, there's more than one universe. You're not the person that's in charge of all of that. So that has been tremendously helpful in my practice. Another perspective, and it's educational, quite frankly. And that educational is foundational because it helps you the next time and the next time. So perspective for me.
It has contributed, it being my interactions with certain primarily minority prosecutors, that their upbringing, their background brings an important perspective to the arena that I so-called battle in. I grew up small town, northern Wisconsin, born in upper Michigan. And coming to the University of Wisconsin, my God, no one traveled over 150 miles to go to college. So I was an outlier there, and my experience here was absolutely fantastic. And even that isn't broad enough. There is a huge world out there, and people have different life experiences, and you have to embrace those and understand those.
Yeah, I think it goes right back. It goes right back to Caryn's Susan Boyle example, doesn't it? Everybody judged Susan Boyle when she walked out based on their own experiences and where they come from, and they found out that there's something totally different out there. Caryn, your response to this?
Well, I can answer that from a slightly different experiential point. I write a column for the Pioneer Press, and I recently interviewed Jack Brewer, who was, among other things, a pro football player, grew up in Texas, was subjected to racism as a young man growing up. And I talked with him about his experiences, and he said to me, you know, I don't want a crutch. Don't give me a crutch. Give me tools. Don't give me a crutch.
All right. I lied. There were only 2 questions. I got one email twice. So, so that's it on the email questions. Any questions from any of you in the room? All right. Well, listen, I want to thank the panelists very much. You were all fantastic. It was a great discussion. I'm sure there's more we could have drilled down into, but thank you very much for the time allotted. I thought we covered some good ground. Thank you for attending, and we will see you next year for our next seminar. Thank you very much. And thanks to the viewers on the web.